Good evening, everybody. And on behalf of the Institute of Politics, I would like to welcome you to tonight's panel on the GenForward survey, our campaign's Hearing Millennials. We have a great panel this evening, but before we get to that, I'd like to tell you about another event we have coming up Thursday right back here in International House. We will be welcoming 3 young mayors, all rising stars on the political scene who are all amazing. They'll be here for a panel discussion moderated by former mayor of Houston, Anise Parker, and they'll be talking about their innovative solutions to some of the most intransigent problems our cities are facing today, such as opiate addiction, economic development, policing. I think you'll find it really interesting. They're all young, and they're all people to watch. So we hope to see you Thursday at 6:15, and we'll be registering for that event after this one as well, if you're interested. I want to thank iHouse for letting us be here tonight, and I want to introduce tonight's student introducer. Abe Friedman is a second year from Seattle, Washington, and he is an economics and sociology major. He's been an events ambassador for us, and we got to know him last year, and we're thrilled to have him back. And he participates in a lot of things. So, Abe, I will let you take it away.
It is my great pleasure to introduce the esteemed members of our panel tonight in discussing the political and social schema of millennial voters. We will be unpacking the GenForward survey, which provides data on millennials, especially those of color, and how they feel about policing, gun violence, immigration, and education policy. First, I would like to welcome Professor Cathy Cohen to the panel. Cathy Cohen is the director and founder of the Black Youth Project, as well as the chair of the Political Science Department here at the University of Chicago. Additionally, Cathy has authored the book, The Boundaries of Blackness, AIDS and the Breakdown of Black Politics, as well as Democracy Remixed, Black Youth and the Future of American Politics. Next up is Jesse Moore, Vice President for Civic Engagement at Rock the Vote, a nonprofit organization focused on registering youth and young adults to vote. Jesse has worked as a speechwriter at the White House and served as the political director for Obama for America in North Carolina. It is also my pleasure to introduce our Institute Director, David Axelrod. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by Emma Green, a staff writer for The Atlantic magazine, where she covers politics, policy, and religion. Thank you all for participating on this panel, and thank you to everyone who ventured to the International House to join us today. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Abe. That was a great introduction, and we're excited to be here for this panel. I'm always thrilled to get to talk about the elusive young person who is parsed over and over again in the news media, especially when it comes to elections and politics. Thankfully, we've got someone here today who actually knows what's what about youth voters. Cathy Cohen is going to kick us off by talking a little bit about the GenForward survey, why she started it, what the findings have been, and a little bit about the methodology that she's been through to get her findings.
Great. How's everybody doing?
Great.
Oh, I like that. The enthusiasm. All right.
Professional instructor.
There you go. That's right. Come on in, people. So I'm Cathy Cohen. I am no longer chair. Where you at, Abe? Thank you, though, of the Political Science Department. I say that very happily. But I did do all the other things that you said. So I'm going to just start us off, 3 to 5 minutes to explain to you about GenForward. So GenForward, I would say, is the first of its kind. That's how we talk about it all the time. A monthly survey of young people, shorthand meaning millennials. So we survey 18 to 30-year-olds every month so that we can both be current but incredibly topical. Now, what does that mean? And you'll stop me if I go too long. Generally, if you're an academic, you have a chance to survey people maybe once a year. So that means that the incentive is to write questions actually that aren't that interesting because you want your data to last for years and years and years. So you might not ask a question, for example, about Black Lives Matter because you would worry that once you got your data back, if there was no longer a Black Lives Matter movement, that data would be irrelevant. The beauty of doing a monthly survey is that we can take a risk every month and ask about something or ask about many things that are incredibly topical. So that's one unique thing about GenForward. The second incredibly unique thing about GenForward is that, in fact, it's a survey that really tries to focus on what millennials actually look like. And what I mean by that is that we include oversamples of African Americans, Latinos, Latinx, right, Asian American young people, so that in fact we have a kind of real and accurate vision of what millennials are really thinking, and I would say what the future of the country is going to look like, right? The reason we do this is that in fact we believe that millennials are critically important. It's hard to believe, but in fact, millennials are now the largest generation, larger than baby boomers. It's also the most racially and ethnically diverse generation. But even though it's racially and ethnically diverse, far too many of the surveys that you read, or this is U of C, if you wake up in the morning, you're watching Morning Joe, and they flash see, I know, Morning Joe. If they flash a poll on the television screen, quite often that poll does not include, I would say, an adequate number of folks of color, and we're trying to correct for that. The other thing I'm going to say is that it's important to survey millennials, and in particular millennials of color, because really when we think about often some of the crises and the opportunities that confront this country, whether it's public education or thinking about questions of violence or how do we strengthen the economy, these are issues, or for example, reforming criminal justice, or abolishing the police, right? These are issues that fundamentally and disproportionately impact young folks of color. And it is a crime, I will dare say, that we don't include their voices in the decision-making around those issues, right? So what we're trying to do is amplify the voices of young people, expand the political community, the democratic community, right? So that, in fact, those individuals who are most at the center of some of the issues that confront us can be a part of those decisions. So I'll stop there.
Wow, that was very disciplined.
Thank you. I'm scared of Emma.
I'm cracking the
gave us a
whip. I'm
stern
cracking the
talking
whip.
to.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, millennials gotta show what's what around here. So we'll go a little bit into methodology later, and a little bit also into the limitations of polls. This is something that interests me in my reporting, and I think something that each of the panelists here can speak to, especially as we're in a room full of young people getting told by panelists what you think.
Yeah.
I think it would be good to go into the limits of polls as well, but I want to kick us off for the full panel talking a little bit about this terrible, awful election. I feel as though there's sort of a mood in the air that people have been feeling that this is just an awful time in American politics. It doesn't matter if you're gung-ho for one candidate or another. There's been a lot of terrible rhetoric on both sides, a lot of damage, just horrible, horrible harm and discord, and you can see that in some of the GenForward numbers. One that really struck me was that more than half of Americans who are 18 to 30 have an unfavorable opinion of Hillary Rodham Clinton. 75% have an unfavorable opinion of Donald Trump. And I have to wonder, what does this mean for what's going to happen on Election Day? And what does it also mean for how millennials are engaging with this election? So maybe since, Jesse, you work directly with millennial voters and trying to get them to turn out, what do you think is going to happen?
These are my people. You are my people. They're like,
Even
no.
the young at heart.
Yeah, that's right. So, what's going to happen? I think that number is scary. Those numbers are scary. That many people see the two main presidential candidates as unfavorable. It scares the hell out of me a little bit. But it also kind of reveals for me what I hope to be an opening. The reality is all the issues that you've already heard mentioned up here, from policing to criminal justice reform, the things that move young people on social media, but also into the streets. You can't turn on your TV after a big event happens in one of our communities without seeing young people taking the time and energy and bringing their passion to march in the streets. Now, that's not a disengaged generation, if you ask me. This is a very engaged generation. The problem is there's a disconnect between the tenor of the politics at the top of the ticket and that passion that young people are feeling. So young people are feeling very passionate about issues, and like the top of the ticket isn't particularly motivated to speak to those issues, if that makes sense. So I do think that as you get closer to the election over the next few weeks, you're going to hear hopefully both candidates, probably more likely the Clinton campaign, speak more to some of these issues, and you'll see, I don't know, turnout, the likelihood of turnout ratchet up a little bit.
So we were talking before the panel a little bit about third parties, and this is something that's been spoken about a lot with millennials, that millennials are just going to go for Gary Johnson or Jill Stein because they just don't really care about voting for Hillary or Donald Trump. So what do you think is true and what is not true about this, Cathy?
Yeah, okay, so the first thing I have to do is, because I was so disciplined, I left some people off. So first of all, let me just say that we do this work, the Black Youth Project does this work in conjunction with AP-NORC, the Associated Press, NORC, Center for Public Affairs, and I want to thank them for their incredible work. And we'll talk more about the methodology, but now I'll say something about third parties. So third parties have been kind of keeping me up at night because the team that we work on this, we all know that what's being reported is absolutely wrong. So there, I see nods, yes. So there was a Quinnipiac poll that said 44% of young people, millennials, are going to vote for a third party. There was a CBS New York Times poll that said 36% would be voting for a third party. Now, here's the problem in terms of how they figured that out. They took what's called a general population survey, so that's 18 and above. And then they said, well, let's figure out what 18 to 34-year-olds are going to do. So that shrinks that general population survey down to this. So maybe they have 300 people in the 18 to 34. Out of that 300 people, right, if they don't have an oversample like we do, that means about 12% are African Americans, 15% are Latinos. And so they have very small numbers of young people of color, and they have much larger numbers of white millennials. So if the story is that white millennials might vote for Gary Johnson, that is true. In our data, we find that about 15% of white millennials say that they might vote for Gary Johnson or third party. But for African American, Latinos, and to some degree Asian Americans, the numbers are in single digits. So this is the difficulty when you have polls declaring things about something they call millennials, like they're a monolithic group, without paying attention to kind of millennials of color. And so they get it, I dare say, completely wrong. And then they tell a narrative about the election that kind of replicates and replicates, completely erasing the reality of how young people of color are thinking about this. The last thing I'll say is that I think the worry for someone like a Hillary Clinton is less that millennials, or in particular her base, millennials of color, are going to vote for Gary Johnson. The bigger threat is that there's a lack of excitement and they're not going to vote. Right. So that is the real threat for her group of millennials.
Right. And that sort of fits with what you were commenting on, Jesse, is this idea of a really engaged millennial voter base, but not necessarily engaged with the question of politics or electoral politics at the top of the ticket. There was another statistic from the GenForward survey that really struck me on this count. In terms of honesty and trustworthiness, 70% of millennials 18 to 30 don't believe that Clinton is honest or trustworthy. 80% don't believe that Trump is trustworthy, and that includes 95% of African American young people. And this to me speaks to just an enormous amount of disillusionment. Talk about narratives of the campaign. This is one that to me rings true in terms of the reporting that I've done, and certainly to the polling that we've seen from GenForward and elsewhere. David, what's your take on this in terms of young people's disillusionment with politics and how this feeling of non-trustworthiness, especially from the top of the ticket, might affect younger voters?
Well, in terms of the whole genesis of the Institute of Politics here was my concern that I was meeting all these inspiring young people who, I think this is the most sort of committed group of young people I've seen in many years, but there is a sense that they have a responsibility to do something larger than themselves for the future and so on, but a real skepticism as to whether politics is a respectable or an effective way to do it. So I've said this, some of you have heard me say, I raise issues and young people say to me, well, we'll create an app, to deal with that, or we'll engage in social media, which are powerful forces. And I always say, government and politics, we can learn a lot from that. But Congress is going to meet with you or without you, and the president is going to be there making fateful decisions. So this stuff matters. I always, I think a lot about, Al Gore was out with Hillary Clinton last week. That race for president was decided by 537 votes in the state of Florida. So if 1,000 of those 90,000 people, many of them young, who voted for Ralph Nader in that election in Florida had voted for Al Gore, very likely we wouldn't have gone into Iraq. We probably wouldn't have spent the surplus that was fairly substantial at that time in the way it was spent. And we would have been way down the road on climate change because that was Gore's priority. Those are pretty significant issues to founder on 1,000 votes. And so the notion that these things don't matter just isn't true. In terms of, Barack Obama inspired young voters, and the percentage of the young participating in that presidential race as a percentage of the whole took a quantum leap from 4 years earlier. And even though there was speculation that young people wouldn't be as engaged 4 years ago, they were. It was the same sort of 18, 19% of the overall. I am eager to see how much turnout there is because of what you say. This is a dispiriting election, and there's no two ways about it. And it's very hard to get motivated simply by your distaste for the other candidate. And there are these lingering issues that Hillary Clinton has failed to dispel. And I think that there's an issue. I think young people have big bullshit meters. And how many have big bullshit meters here? See, this is the target right here. We call these the basket of explorables.
Right.
So, but young people have big bullshit meters, and I know Hillary Clinton very well, and I've worked with her on stuff, and she was really impressive to me, but she has had a hard time to speak in. She speaks in a political idiom, and I think that compounds her problem, and particularly with younger voters. One last point on this third party thing. I do. First of all, what Cathy said is important, and you should generalize from it. Most public polling is highly flawed and unreliable, and media is looking for ways to advance a story. So any poll that comes out gets reported and given equal weight as the last poll, even if that poll is completely contradictory to the last poll that they reported 6 hours earlier. That number was alarming, but not obviously supported by this data. But Gary Johnson, 15%, he was here. Did anybody see him when he was here? 15% among white millennials. And what's intriguing to me is you look through the issues that white millennials say they're concerned about. And, Gary Johnson, I'm not making an endorsement or a disendorsement, but he's got an A rating from the NRA. He would eliminate the corporate tax and the income tax and replace it with a consumption tax, which isn't going to help inequality in any way. He says he may withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. And so it's bewildering. I think it is more a vote of no confidence in the major party candidates as much as enchantment with Gary Johnson, or just a lack of knowledge about Gary Johnson that draws young people who don't necessarily share his views to him.
Yeah. Well,
Can I just, we were both nodding like yes, yes.
Yeah.
But there's also a question where we ask about favorables and unfavorables, and one of the answers is, I just don't know enough about this person.
Right.
And Gary Johnson and many third candidates, right? Jill Stein also, significant numbers of young people across race and ethnic groups say, I don't really know enough about this person.
Right.
Anyway. Yeah, so.
Right.
Did you cross-match the people so they didn't know enough
Who
about
said
it
they
to
were
rate
gonna
them
vote
who were
for it? Yeah,
voting for?
we did not do that, but
Yeah.
something else we can put on our list, yeah.
That sort of reminds me when Gary Johnson had his famous "What is Aleppo" gaffe. There was a great headline in the Washington Post where they asked people from Aleppo if they knew what a Gary Johnson was. And in fact, many people did not. So I think he ended up worse on that count. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but let's just spend a couple of thoughts on the one candidate who became the unlikely darling, so the story goes, of millennials in this election. We're talking about demographics and diversity, but in fact it was an old white man with a halo of white hair who in fact is a socialist who won the hearts of millennials, or so the narrative went. Talk a little bit about the legacy of the Bernie phenomenon and what that means now that he's long been out of the race, that he's kind of taken a back seat. You don't hear that much about him now at this stage in the election, and what we can sort of conclude and perhaps take moving forward from what he was able to do early on in the Democratic primary.
I think there's a few things people like about Bernie. I mean, he has to be the most surprising visual to see in front of a hugely energetic crowd of young people. It's the strangest thing ever, but it works. And part of it is because
Could it be that Clinton and Trump are just too young?
that's right, yeah. They're too youthful. They're
Yes.
just inexperienced.
Right.
But I think Senator Sanders, I always want to call him Bernie, but Senator Sanders, he comes at politics as a progressive first. He's not a politician, I think, even in his own mind, or at least he's effectively convinced me and many others of that. So when people listen to him, they don't feel like they're listening to a politician. They think they feel more like they're listening to a revolutionary. They feel more like they're listening to somebody who's, a public servant before they're a politician. And that's a pretty impressive trick for somebody who's been in Congress for as long as he has. But that narrative and that image is something that he absolutely nailed. And I think the combination of him being able to nail that persona and the other options, doors number 2 and 3, being so familiar and feeling so, I don't want to jump too much on this, but it feels so nasty in the campaign. Everything feels hyper-partisan, hyper-political, and here's this guy who came out of nowhere to millennials and sounded like an unapologetic progressive. I think it was just a breath of fresh air that they didn't see coming and breathed it in.
Yeah. Okay.
You want me to say something about, we talked about this, about the Bernie myth, and how polling can change maybe what the narrative could have been. What we were talking about is in our June survey, we asked millennials, who did you vote for in the primary, if you vote? Did you vote in the primary, and who did you vote for? And I was saying that there's generally been a narrative out there that there were millennials, and it was often thought to be kind of white millennials, the Bernie bros on one side, and then you got a narrative, in particular when the primaries were in the South, that all African Americans loved Hillary Clinton, or at least they were voting for her. But that actually, when you looked at our data, and we can talk more about why our data is good compared to the bad data. When you looked at the data, it was a majority of African American millennials who voted in the primaries voted for Bernie. A majority of Latino millennials who voted in the primaries didn't vote for Hillary, voted for Bernie. A majority of Asian American millennials who voted in the primary voted for Bernie. And less than a majority of young whites who voted in the primary voted for Bernie, right? So actually, the majority of young people of color voted for Bernie, and a plurality of young whites voted for Bernie, right? So what would have happened if the press would have gotten that story right? If we would have thought about the Obama coalition, in particular among young people, as gravitating around Bernie, if we could have pushed back on the kind of dichotomy between millennials, meaning young white millennials, and African Americans, to complicate who in fact was really supporting Bernie, and to kind of really tear into the press who couldn't kind of deal with the nuance in thinking about kind of the diversity of millennial votes.
It would have been it would have been, if you just on the face of it, Bernie was getting 75 to 80% of that vote. He couldn't get that in a diverse state unless he was getting a good percentage among minority millennials. The problem he had was that as a percentage of the African American vote, particularly in these southern states, millennial voters were not nearly the participants as older African American voters, and he never was able to make great inroads with them.
Right, but I think, in fact, if the Sanders campaign had really pushed a narrative that said, look, younger African American millennials are supporting us in a way that they didn't. Yeah. I think they actually could have begun to make inroads further in the primary season in a way that they weren't able to. That's interesting.
Well, I mean, I never understood, and this is off the point, I never understood why Bernie Sanders was a student here. He led a sit-in over discriminatory housing policies. He was involved in the desegregation effort in the Chicago public schools, and he never really talked about it. He had his speech, and it was a great speech, and he never changed it really from start to finish. But just one last point, and I think on the Bernie phenomenon, whatever else he was, because he had this speech, and because he was in so many ways so obviously not like politics as usual, he seemed very authentic. And I think authenticity is a major, major predictor, and particularly among young people for the reason I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that actually provided a great segue into what I wanted to ask about next. Talking again about this disillusionment that a lot of young people seem to feel, it seems like there are a number of issues, and we'll hit on a few, hopefully. But one I wanted to highlight first is race, as we've been talking about, both in terms of the demographics of young voters, but also some of the racial conflicts that we've been seeing in different cities, whether it has to do with conflicts over policing, to some of the racist rhetoric that we've heard on the campaign trail. There was another number from the GenForward survey that I thought was really striking. One of the questions asked young voters to rank their top issues, the 3 that matter most to them. 43% of young African Americans ranked racism among their top 3 issues. 16% of young white voters said the same thing. And that was striking to me because it seems like even among this group that, again, is sort of treated like a monolith, there's a pretty big gap in perception about how pressing racism is as an issue and what our politics should do to address it. So let's talk about that a little bit. Cathy, maybe you can kick us off in terms of racism and the role that that plays in influencing how different groups of young voters think.
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that, in particular, folks of color, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, understand and rank racism as a significant issue compared to whites is probably not that surprising to this community. And if you look at the literature, right, that's been written by political scientists or sociology, this is a broad phenomenon. I think the question, though, is when we look at even more recent events and to see the kind of disparity in how millennials, who are, there is I keep saying narrative, but there's a narrative about the kind of tolerant millennials, and they love each other, and they're the most diverse, and, I'm a little suspect. Like, clearly you can tell from my voice.
Millennials are just as horrible as everybody else.
Yeah, I'm not going to go down the basket of deplorables, but the generation of millennials. So, but one of the questions that we asked, not in this month, but I think in August, we asked, is the killing of young black people, or the killing of black people, an extremely or serious problem? And overwhelmingly, as we would expect, African Americans said yes. Majority of Latinos and Asian Americans said yes, but less than a majority of young whites said yes, right? So I think it's not just in the abstract of something big called racism. It's also in the kind of issues that matter most to young people of color, where we see kind of real differences that we want to be able to pay attention to. Yeah. And I don't think it means that, in fact, we should disregard young whites, but it does, at least for me, mean that to talk about millennials really is kind of empty talk, because it doesn't give us any kind of nuance or understanding of these issues. Now, let me give you one more, factoid here from GenForward, which is that when we ask, is the violence against the police an extremely or a serious problem? all young people, including young whites, but also young people of color, said yes, it was, right? So they all recognized that the violence against the police was a serious or extremely serious issue. But when we talked about the killing of black people, less than the majority of young whites said yes to that.
Yeah.
And I think that's, that is the racial landscape that we're dealing with, and we should expect that those attitudes will have an impact on how people vote. The majority of young people of color in general, and especially among likely voters, say they're gonna vote for Hillary Clinton. Among young whites, it's an even split. About 27% say they're voting for Hillary, 27% say they're voting for Donald Trump. When we go to likely voters, Hillary moves up to about 41%, and then 31% of young whites are voting for Trump. So that's, if we're thinking about kind of the variation in young whites, that's what is really kind of interesting when we're thinking about questions of race.
You were speaking about the way that young people often take up causes, will go in the streets, protest. Obviously, Black Lives Matter has been a huge proponent of sort of protest and movements in the streets. What have you seen as you've talked with young voters about the way racism, racial conflict, policing has affected the way people think about electoral politics specifically?
Well, I think there's two things. There's the way it is affecting it, and there's the way that I just desperately hope that it will over time, and I'll tell you both. I think with what's going on at the presidential level, it's very hard not to have at least one eye on racial politics constantly. I mean, it's not a positive thing most of the time. It feels adversarial, it feels ugly, it feels nasty when we're talking about race a lot of the time. So I think that, when people are thinking about the presidential election, they're thinking about us and them. They're thinking about an adversarial relationship between races, which is troubling. Now, what I hope happens is that feeling about politics, is my mic working okay, by the way? It doesn't sound like okay. That feeling about politics does not, and the data so far is showing us that it is, but it does not scare young people away from voting and from politics and public service, but it more scares us to get more engaged. And the reason I say that is, we were having fun backstage talking about this, and David can attest. When Americans generally back out of their driveway and hit a pothole, they write the White House, okay? We're very, very focused on what the president is doing, what the president can do to solve the problems that we're facing. The reality is policing, racial injustice, these are issues that are community issues first and foremost. And what must happen is we as a country have to get more and more educated, and more. We have to shift our obsession from the celebrity of the White House and who's president or who's running for president to what is moving us into the streets, which is policing, racial injustice, and these issues. And those issues, if you're really frustrated with whether or not your police are making good decisions, we have to first ask ourselves, do I know who my sheriff is? Do I know who my district attorney is? Did I help put them into office, or is it now my job to hold them accountable so they'll hold the police accountable? And these are tougher questions to ask than, who am I supporting for president? But the reality is, on an issue like policing, the president of the United States can set a tone for the country. The president of the United States can shine a light, but the sheriff doesn't, and the DA don't report through any labyrinth up to the president. So I guess I say that to say my hope and prayer is that young people will start to recognize that all of our answers won't come from the presidency, and then we'll start to look right around us more and more.
Yeah. So moving again to another source of disillusionment that seemed pretty evident from the survey, economic insecurity and economic issues were something that came up again and again, and again, sort of pulling out one fact of many. I was struck by nearly half of young people have no retirement savings or pension, including 60% of Latinos and Latinas, which, if you're 22 and you don't have a retirement fund, you're probably gonna be fine. But on the other hand, being a young person, these are some of the most important saving years. And to me, that was just sort of one striking measure of many, which said, millennials are in a bad way in terms of the economic legacy that they're inheriting and the prospects that they'll have for the future. David, what's your take on this in terms of the way the economy might shape young people's opinions in particular about politics?
Well, first of all, this generation of young people have lived through very unsettled times when it comes to the economy. We just lived through the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. In that process, you saw a lot of corporations kind of rationalize their operations. So you hear these stories about, although unemployment among college-educated young people is rather low, you do hear these stories of, of kids who went to school and end up back in the basement and so on. Because wages,
debt, too. Now with $80,000 in debt in the basement.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes, with wages kind of flat. And so these are the realities that young people have grown up with. I don't know how many young people are thinking about retirement savings, and I think there's. You are.
You're wise. Okay. You're one of the good ones. This is good.
Spread it around. It's something to think about. But I do think there's a sense of insecurity and a notion, previous generations grew up with this notion that you get a job, you rise in that job. With that job comes health insurance, comes pension, and so on. And there was a sense of security. I don't think that's not the economy of today. So there's a new reality for young people. I just want to, on one other note, there's a lot of really rich data here, which I think we can learn a lot from. One question I had about it, Cathy, was just because I was trying to figure out why the Trump effect among young white voters. And I noticed that that the college-educated, this is the exit poll from 2012, and college-educated, or with some college or college education, were 72% in the exit poll, only 59 in this poll, 40% high school or less. And so it makes me wonder whether you may be capturing a little bit more lower-income white young people, and that might skew the Trump number a little.
No, so it's very fun. Hey, Matt is back there, who's our postdoc. We just did this economic analysis. We just kind of broke our respondents up into 3 different categories. And what was really kind of striking was that the Trump support for whites wasn't located in 25,000 and less. It was actually, in particular, among young whites, 25 to 60,000, and to some degree, 60,000 and above. And we have this kind of theory that, in fact, this is a group that feels and has heard the kind of message about about white people losing ground, right? And so if you've been poor or relatively poor, losing ground doesn't resonate, because in fact, you've lost your ground, right?
Yeah, I just wonder, I would look at it,
yes.
I'm eager to, I'd like to see the break on, because education to me is a better kind of predictor, but I take...
No, we took those 3 categories in part because they're fairly evenly distributed across those 3. I hear you about kind of, we can also look at education.
Yeah, but in the main, I thoroughly accept what you're...
You do?
Thoroughly.
I feel like...
Especially when you look at me like that.
I feel like, Cathy, you and I are sort of here as the apologists. You're the apologist for polling, and I'm the apologist for all of the press and the media.
Let me stop. I'm not apologizing for anybody's polling. No, I don't apologize for much. I guess I'm Trump like that. But, there are clear challenges to even our polling. So I feel like I didn't go through this. What we do is we have 500 African Americans, 500 whites, 500 Latinos, 250 Asian Americans. So we have a sample size of 1,750 as our bottom, and usually it's closer to 2,000. That is rare in a nationally representative sample. We then weight the data so it is nationally representative, right? We use age and education and gender and region to weight the data. So I feel very kind of committed to this data and this project. At the same time, for example, our Asian American sample, we only provide the survey in English, so in fact there's a bias there. So we recognize that there are places, in fact, that we want to improve, but feel good about the data, but would never apologize for polling. Because most polling, as David said, sucks. Yeah.
Well, and this is a good time to put out the pitch.
That's right. Yeah.
It's GenForwardSurvey.com, right?
GenForwardSurvey.com is the website,
Yeah,
and you
so
can
go check that out. So I'm going to turn it over to you all to ask questions in just 1 minute. So be thinking of things that you would like to ask. And if you want to go ahead, if you do have a question already, and make your way to the mic, if you don't mind hanging out there for a minute or two. I'm going to ask one more question, though, because I'm selfish. I want to get to an issue or a set of issues that are close to my heart. I was struck by what millennials didn't care about in the ranking of the issues that they thought were the most pressing or mattered the most in politics. Less than 5% of respondents ranked the following issues: gay rights, women's rights, abortion, morality and religion in society. To me, this is radical for so many different reasons, but one of those is that I cover religion predominantly, religion and politics. And I see lots of ways that religion and religious issues, some of these issues that are often religious, resonate so deeply, or at least are live questions for so many young people that I talk to. So I guess, I wanted to toss that over to you all to see what you make of it, partially because to me, maybe this is just you have only 3 choices, so you put these other issues ahead of these different issues. It could be a signal of the death of culture war style politics. But I was just interested in what you all might make of that. Does anybody want to take that one?
Nobody wants that one. Those are, that surprises me too. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
But I will also say it's a long list, and I think young people care about all of these issues, but
Right.
something had to kind of work its way to the bottom. But that did surprise me, especially the gender equality and LGBT rights. I figured
Right.
one way or another those would be of interest. I don't know why that is. I do think that gender equality has been a real focal point for our current administration. These topics have been, very much in the news, especially with Secretary Clinton, her historic candidacy. Maybe it's some saturation point where people just are ready to talk about other issues. I don't know.
Right, or they think they're settled. Yeah.
I wondered when there was this interesting interchange in the New Hampshire primary when some older female leaders, Madeleine Albright and others, kind of lectured younger women on their obligations to
Right.
support Hillary Clinton on the basis of gender. And obviously, if you look at the voting data, younger women basically rejected that and voted for Bernie Sanders. And I wondered whether part of it was barriers have been broken. The president broke this barrier. It seems less exceptional. I don't know if young women think that it is an insuperable barrier for women to become president of the United States. So their attitude was, I want a woman to be president of the United States. I just want a different woman, and I'll
Right.
vote for one someday.
Right. Right.
So, it could be that in some ways, the progress that is made, not to say that there isn't room for a lot more progress, has made these issues. We've seen enormous progress in terms of gay rights in the last 8 years.
Right.
It may be that this just doesn't rise to the top because people feel like we've made some progress.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I'm going to turn it over to student questioners. If you could say your name, if there's a relevant fact about what you're studying, obviously not your full life biography, although I'm sure it's quite interesting.
We already know that he's worried about his retirement.
That's true. This guy is the guy we need to ask
Yes.
savings questions about. But go ahead and direct your question up.
You can blame my SecReg professor for that. He's teaching us all about mutual funds.
That's
My name is Matt. I'm a 2L at the law school, so second year for those of you who don't know the lingo. And I was a Bernie voter in my primary, but now am a staunch Hillary Clinton supporter. And in my conversations with my friends who were Bernie voters and are still a little bit sour on how the primary turned out, one thing that I've really been trying to focus on is that she actually adopted a lot of the platform that Bernie had, and I consider that to be a huge victory. Is there something that you've noticed in your polling about how that doesn't really resonate with millennials and what might be more effective at getting there? Because on the policy positions, from what I see when I get my friends to take like the isidewith.org test, it's pretty clear.
Yeah, I think what you laid out is exactly what's happening, and then if we throw in what Emma says, I think there's just a disgust with the two candidates that are presented. But I think even with that disgust, right, most millennials of color who say they're going to vote are going to vote for Hillary. It really is about kind of convincing young white millennials that I guess Hillary or whomever is in their best interest. I mean, there's, as part of this September survey, we asked some questions about kind of who could best handle some of the economic issues that you care about. And it was really, again, only among young whites that we saw this interesting split. When we said who would be the best job creator, more young whites said Donald Trump, right? When we asked who would best deal with inequality, the majority said Hillary. So I think that there is a kind of real split there. And discussed among both candidates. I think for most millennials of color, their unfavorables with Donald Trump are so high. Their sense that he, we asked earlier in other surveys, do you think he's a racist? And of course, many, many, many young people said he's. So I think voting for him is just off the table for them. But so for your friends, I think there's a real kind of tension about, yeah, we think she might be better on most of these issues, but maybe on some of the things I also really care about, she wouldn't be as great.
I also think on this authenticity issue, in a certain way, the fact that she, having battled Bernie all through the primaries, then says, okay, I can be for that if he can be for me, seems very inauthentic and kind of old politics. So it's not terribly persuasive that, under duress, she came to that position. I think she's got a lot of policy on inequality and so on, but on some things like free tuition, she was dragged to it by Bernie, and a lot of his supporters know that.
Can I also say, and this is a completely biased stance here, but to a certain degree, millennials, and I'm including myself, I'd barely make the cut, believe it or not. But people laughing pretty hard out there. But to a certain degree, this generation has been spoiled by President Obama. His victory and the way he's approached his presidency has been pretty great in terms of engaging young people and making young people, especially in the second term, feel rewarded for having supported him. And I think there's a certain amount of frustration from young people who maybe have not had to vote for someone they didn't get all the way behind before. A protest vote might seem more palatable, whereas before, my first few elections, I wasn't jumping out of my socks to vote for somebody, but I knew that, to your point, I knew the policy issues that mattered the most to me, and I was going to vote for the person that was going to get me as close as possible to the ideals that I cared about. And I think I wonder, I guess, if there's a certain amount of frustration amongst young people who are now learning in this post-Obama world what it kind of feels like.
Yeah.
But I guess I would be careful because, and I hear you completely, but remember, a majority of young whites voted for Romney, not for Obama in 2012, right? So it isn't that there's, we loved Obama and he was so great, and now, oh my God, what am I going to do? Sure. They bailed on Obama in 2012. Yeah. So I think there is, again, this way in which we imagine that all millennials are kind of progressive and ready to vote for the Democrat, and it doesn't make sense to us. But in fact, we could think of it as voting against their interests. I think they're also, the range of young people and their economic situations they don't always show up when we're in a kind of forum like this.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. So the next questioner, again, introduce yourself and give us a very short piece of context about what you're doing at Chicago.
Excellent. My name's Ronan Shatsky, and I'm a first year, and I may study politics, I may study neuroscience, I'm not sure. I'm interested in both. But anyway, so I was very interested by what you said. I forget what your name is. Jesse, right? What you said about the importance of refocusing from the celebrity phenomenon of voting for who's president and pay more attention to stuff on the community level. maybe even local politics. So I'm wondering if there's any data about people's interest in local politics. And I'm wondering in general if any of you have any ideas about how to make local politics sexier.
Man.
Make
That's
local
okay.
politics
That's
sexy
you.
again. This is a Justin Timberlake song, right?
That's right.
I mean, please intern with us this summer, dude. Literally. I have not seen data on this, and actually, as you were talking, I was sitting here thinking, I was like, I wonder how we could, work up some models to highlight the gaps between people's interest in issues or how much they like candidates at the presidential level and how much those issues are actually determined by a president of the United States versus a local official. So, this might be the start of a beautiful relationship right here, where we might be,
Yes.
on the road after this trying to figure this out. So I've not seen numbers. I will say that, at Rock the Vote, one of the things we're going to do when it's a non-presidential year and every single news cycle is about the presidential race and it's the horse race, we're talking about how most polls suck. The reality is there's so much airtime to fill on the news. They are dying for anything to talk about a lot of the time. And I mean, it's, I know you know.
Condemnation of the media. I mean.
But they're dying for anything to talk about. So they're looking for, not only are they looking for a poll to talk about, but they're looking for something in that poll that supports an existing narrative that will drive viewership or drive clicks. So I will say this, when we get out of that kind of haze that we're in right now, one of the things that we're going to be working on, and I hope more people will be doing the same, are local events, focused on kind of gritty issues around policing, around clean water, around some of these issues that sometimes escape us, but also bringing, I know this sounds corny, but also bringing some of the hometown heroes, celebrities from back to their hometowns to talk about these issues and try to make them a little bit sexier.
I wonder whether, first of all, the truth is that the turnout, how the turnout in local elections is often abysmal.
It is, exactly.
And that extends to young people. So, but I wonder sometimes whether the Democratic Party has contributed to some of this, the problem that you identified, Jesse, by making the president and the federal government the fulcrum of so much and suggesting that we can solve these problems from the top down.
Are you becoming a Republican?
No.
Is that the headline for this?
No, but I do think. Look, I always challenge Democrats to say, take your values and ideals and fit them into a modern context. Look at what worked and what didn't work. And now we live in this time with all these tools we never had that allow change to happen in different ways. And are there ways you can catalyze those changes, even if you can't dictate them from the top? And I just, but we create this notion. And part of it is Democrats have seated a lot of state houses, legislatures, Congress has been gridlocked, and the notion is, well, what can the president do with the power that he has to try and create some progressive action? And it just puts a lot of weight on the presidency when maybe we have to be a little bit more innovative. Look, I have a lot of regard, it's controversial, but Arnie Duncan, what he did with the race to the top and some of trying to leverage the influence that he had to get local governments to look for innovative ways to raise standards and deal with other problems. I always thought that was like a good innovation.
Yeah.
And I know it was, as I said, I know it's controversial, but no, I'm not becoming a Republican, but I do think that Democrats need to renew themselves.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I do want to we have a long line, so I want to make sure we can get to more student questions.
Wait,
You're asking, you're asking great questions though. So introduce yourself and give us a little piece of context.
Hi, I'm Michael Lynch. This is my first year at University of Chicago, which actually ties into my question. Because that would make me the last year of the Millennials opposed to the first for the other end, Jesse. And my question is just about, I don't know if you looked at this, but do you see any difference between the older end Millennials and the younger end Millennials, particularly thinking about that the older ones were coming of age generally around the time of the Great Recession, whereas the ones that are my age were barely 10 then and can't really remember it.
Right. I believe that the technical term of art here is old millennials versus young millennials for people who are not initiated. So old millennials versus young millennials in terms of voting patterns, demographics, that kind of thing.
I'm sure there is a difference. I'm looking at David or Matt. We haven't done that analysis yet. So yes, you're a young millennial. Is that what we're calling you?
Yes.
Yes. So I'm absolutely
He's
sure.
a last millennial.
He's a he's a last millennial, and you're a first millennial. Okay. Anyway, the other thing that we forget about old millennials is that many are much more kind of settled and stable. Some have children. Some are married or have a partner. Some have been employed for a very long time. Some have postgraduate degrees. All of those things matter in terms of determining something like the vote. But we also know that when we're talking about participation and engagement, we're not just talking, this is what I was going to say in the last question, we're not just talking about the vote either, right? So even if we're thinking about the local level and communities, we could be thinking about community organizing, not the local, and I appreciate you, the local Democratic Party, right? So I suspect that we would see pretty significant, some differences that would be significant, but I don't have that. All that to say, I don't have the data.
I think this will be interesting also to see the next generation that comes after. You put your finger on something that's really interesting. There's so much hand-wringing that goes on about millennials, and we're going to have to start doing the whole thing over again when people who are younger than you start coming into college and moving beyond. So, all right, next questioner.
Thank you so much for this event. My name is Henry. I'm a first year at the college studying political science. It was very clear to me seeing then Senator Obama in front of the state capitol in 2007 talking about the transition from the politics of the old to the politics of the new, that he was very successful in making politics relevant to the youth vote. Specifically for Mr. Axelrod, because he was pivotal in this, why was the president successful, and how successful was Hillary Clinton in making the case of the relevancy of politics to our generation in this race?
Well, the Obama campaign in 2008 was sort of an assault on politics as usual, and that was its appeal in some of the same ways that Bernie Sanders made that appeal. He laid out a series of objectives that were bigger than sort of tactical, and that were kind of long range in scope, and he's pursued many of them. I think that is important. I go back to the BS point. We have significant challenges as a country, and I think young people and older people are going to respond to frank talk and less political talk about how we deal with them. The problem is that, a lot of things that when he committed to health care reform, or when he took the position he took on Iran and trying to negotiate or at least talk to hostile leaders and so on, these were risky. And I think, and he got rewarded in some ways for that, for being willing to take those risks and essentially sending the message that there are more important things even than winning an election, and that is standing for the things that you should win to fight for. And I think, so, I spent 25 years as a political strategist making ads and doing all that stuff. And I think we've we've perfected the art of survey research and polling and data analytics and so on, so that we can construct the perfectly calibrated candidacy. And I think a lot of people are repelled by the perfectly calibrated candidacy. So I think you got to take some risks and kind of speak your heart about what the big challenges are facing the country.
It's interesting. It's like the uncanny valley for politicians, right? They're just a little bit too made in the image of what we say we want, being sort of a repellent factor,
That's
right?
exactly right.
Yeah.
And there's also the issue of courage, which I think you're speaking to. And some of the things that Barack Obama did when he came out, the fact that he was coming out at all seemed courageous. And young people like courage. They like people taking a chance, people stepping out. And that's something that's really hard for Secretary Clinton to do, because this has been a slow drip for her to get towards the presidency. It's taken a long time, and so it doesn't feel as fresh or courageous to a lot of people.
Leaving her out of it, I just think there is a perception that is not wrong, and having spent some time in Washington, I can attest to it, that the majority of politicians, their first mission is perpetuation of themselves in office.
Right.
And there's a smaller, more admirable cohort that are willing to risk their selves, that risk their own careers in order to advance goals. But I always say there's a reason why Profiles in Courage was such a slim volume. That's unusual. We say we want, as you say, we say we want that in our politicians, but when our politicians actually act on it, it's the rare politician who can navigate those straits, and Barack Obama was one of those.
Yeah. All right, next question.
Hi, my name's Nadia Owens. I teach high school here at the lab school, and I'm a history teacher. And my question is, so this election will be my 7th since my birth, and it's been really interesting for me to talk to students about elections, especially the juniors and seniors that I teach, and for those that are able to vote, to prepare them, and those that will be able to vote in the next election, to excite them. And I think that my question is, they're very disillusioned. Many of them are very disillusioned by this election. Especially those that aren't yet able to vote but are just on the cusp that are 17. And I've been thinking a lot about, and my question is, how do I prepare them, how do I excite them for the next election when many of them could stay home because of the past 4 years? Or, excuse me, of the past 2 years. It felt like 4 years, but 2 years.
Yeah, that's such a powerful question, thinking about the voters who are coming up, maybe looking ahead to 2016 as their first election, or who have this as their sort of most recent memory. What do you all think? How do you grapple with that as a teacher and educator?
I will say, I think what we were talking about, refocusing the country on the power of local elections could be a really interesting thing to do in your classroom. And again, it may not sound really exciting, but if you can find a way to do that, I think it could go a long way. And it's also, you can find races. We talked about the Florida race, or the Florida deciding the election in 2000, but also I think that there was a big uprising of young people who affected a DA race out here not too long ago in Chicago. Yeah, and if you can paint those pictures and let people know just how massive even a small uprising of youth voters can be, that might be an exciting way to do it.
I think what we can't do is surrender to this notion that it doesn't make a difference, that it's all futile. And I can tell you, I'll tell you two things. One is my interest in politics was seeded by one event, which was I grew up in New York City in a housing development, and there was a wonderful woman who looked after me when my mother was at work, named Jessie Berry. She was an African-American woman, and she had come up from the South with very little formal education and took care of other people's children so she could take care of her own. And she came from the South Carolina, at a time when you could get killed for just trying to register to vote. She took me there. She put me on top of a mailbox. We watched John F. Kennedy jump up on a platform. This was 12 days before the 1960 election. And it was, the whole event was really inspiring to me, because there was this sense that something really important was happening, and that this was an opportunity to steer history. And I raise it only because I think all the time about what she would have thought about the fact that the little boy she put on that mailbox ended up working for the first African-American president, or whether she could have even imagined the day when there would be an African-American president. And that happened because a lot of people did not turn away, but turned into the wind and committed themselves to it. The president's favorite quotation is Martin Luther King's, when he said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But it doesn't bend unless we grab the arc. And these elections are our chance to grab the arc. And if we don't, then that moral arc won't bend. And I've seen it bend, and I've seen it bend for the people who didn't have insurance, who have insurance today. I've seen it bend for people, for gay, lesbian Americans who have a different reality today than they did 8 years ago. Even in these very difficult times, I've seen real change happen that touched people's lives in a very, very fundamental way, because a whole bunch of people in 2008 were motivated to go out and work and vote and make a difference. So what we can't do is let you or any of these young people believe that somehow this doesn't make a difference, because it makes a difference.
Okay, so I agree with everything. You were going to clap for David? You should if you want, yeah. Okay. Brilliant, brilliant. I agree to a point, but I guess I wouldn't want to put all of our faith and all of our efforts, and I don't think this is what you were saying, around elections, because I think there are lots of young people who said they voted for the first black president in 2008 and 2012, and then we've seen an epidemic of young black people killed by the police, right? That there has to be an understanding that if in fact you're invested in this, it's about transformation, and it can't be only elections. It has to be mobilization, it has to be organizing, it has to be using digital tools, and there might be young people who don't start with elections, but who start in those other places, and those other places will then lead them maybe to engage in the electoral arena, right? Yeah. We also know that young people are kind of changing things, not by focusing on the state, but by focusing on firms and corporations. So it just seems to me that what we want to do is expand all the places that people can engage and have an impact. And elections are clearly part of that, but to recognize that, in fact, electing any one person, unless you're there to hold them accountable and think about governance, is not going to change anybody's situation.
Okay, so I'm going to crack the whip here. I want to make sure that we get to everybody in line. So yeah, thank you. That was a great question. So I want to make sure that we get everybody who's currently there. So we'll do questions kind of quickly, and then pretty to the point answers. So go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm JT. I'm a second year in the college, studying political science and comparative race and ethnic studies. My question is kind of surrounding this idea of a protest vote. Something I noticed after Bernie lost the primaries was a massive, I guess I can call it a massive start to shaming of people to vote for Hillary Clinton. And I think that when you talk about motivating people to vote, I feel that shaming them and making them feel as though if you don't vote for this person for these reasons, then you will be the cause of the, the end of the world. I feel like that's a really bad way to go about getting people to vote for her, and I feel like that is what, I feel like to a extent that's what she's been doing by saying, if you don't vote for me, you'll get this guy. So you better vote for me, as well as people who campaign for her, or just just her followers on social media and things like that. So I just want to know, what are your ideas? What are your thoughts on this shaming that happens for people who say, I'm not going to vote for either of them because I'm sick of being pigeonholed in politics.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact is that there are two, I'm sorry, Cathy.
There
are two people on the ballot.
That's it.
Who are going to, there are 4 people on the ballot. One of 2 is going to be president of the United States. And I agree with everything that Cathy said. Elections are a part of it. But the fact is that there is a lot of power that is reposed in that office, and it does matter who is president of the United States. So to me, it's not a matter of shame so much as you have a choice, and someone's going to govern, and there is a profound difference between them, and you may fall on one side of the line or the other, but to say, I don't like the choice, therefore I'm not going to choose, and I'll let someone else decide who is going to be the president of the United States, and I'll live with that, is to suggest that there's no difference between them, and I think that is not the case.
I mean, this speaks really powerfully to something that I've been thinking a lot about, which is the feminist narrative of this election, and particularly women voters, and what Hillary Clinton's victory will or will not represent for women's voters. I was telling Cathy that I recently published an article on this, women who don't feel like they're represented by Hillary Clinton. And I think this does speak both to what you're describing, but also to what David is describing, which comes down to a choice. There are two candidates basically to choose from. But to me, what's powerful is the narrative. How is it talked about? And who is either candidate claiming to represent sort of holistically, and I think that can maybe be a source of space or a little bit of breathing room if you are someone who's not enthusiastic about a Hillary, or maybe you're a Trump voter who's not enthusiastic about Trump. That could be, I think, a little bit of breathing room.
One thing we didn't mention, that one group that was the most optimistic group in this poll were young African Americans, and
about their economic futures for sure.
right. And I wonder how much what percentage of that is related to the fact that Barack Obama was president? Just the symbolism of that.
I think that's absolutely right. I don't want to get away from your question. I mean, but I think there has always been a kind of dual processing for young, in particular African Americans, between the pride in having, Barack Obama elected, but also a realization that they didn't think that his election would have much of an impact on their lives. We did a focus group with young African Americans, and they said, we're thrilled he's elected. Not gonna change if I get harassed when I'm walking down the street by the police. Not gonna change a bit.
Yeah.
So I think they had a kind of complexity and nuance and understanding of the limits of the presidency that sometimes many of us don't profess.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Next question.
Hi, my name is Savannah Bowman. I'm a sophomore at Kenwood Academy High School.
Great.
And I know a lot of millennials aren't leaning towards Trump because he has such demagogic rhetoric. And I wanted to know how Obama's appeal to millennials differs from how it differed from Hillary's, and how Hillary can improve hers to appeal to more millennials.
Yeah.
I'll leave it to.
Yeah.
While the clock is ticking on your millennial status, I figure I should let you answer that.
Yeah, I have some data after you.
Thank you. I think so. I think Barack Obama was an incredibly unique. I wasn't in politics, and the only reason I got into this business was because of him. And I think there are a lot of people who only got into the business of voting because of him. And he awakened a new class, a new generation of publicly engaged people. And he did it partially through the power of his personality and the symbolism of who he is, but also with the issues that he addressed and the way he approached it. So I think that's a very unique thing. I think the other thing, which we don't talk about very often, is he also rose at a very unique moment in this past century, and it was as the economy was collapsing, and in the wake of a Bush presidency, which was in a lot of ways very frustrating for young people. Not all young people, but a lot. So a lot of that equaled lightning in a bottle, which I wouldn't, wish on anyone to try to repeat, including Hillary Clinton. That being said, I think she has worked pretty hard. I think the numbers skewing towards her and away from Mr. Trump is a lot to do with her working a lot harder to address issues that young people care about, student debt and policing and climate. So I think she's trying to do what she can with the issues, but I think trying to capture that lightning in a bottle again, it's just, that's a tough road to hoe. Did you?
Well, I was going to just say, for example, we ask about approval rating. He still has overwhelming positive approval ratings, right? 70% for millennials of color, 49% for young whites. And at the same time, when you ask if she's dishonest, like 70% of millennials say she's dishonest. So there's no comparison. What you want to say? Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, but there's also you have to consider the reality of somebody who's been in public life for as long as she has. If Barack Obama had been in public life for 30 years, there may have been some negative narratives that people didn't like.
He's taken a few shots in the last
Yeah,
day.
that's what I said.
Let me just say this. You cannot leave the microphone without us saying how inspiring it is that you're here. You know, so thank you for being here. My advice to Hillary would be to any politician running, know in your own mind what are the things that you'd be willing to lose for. Because I think in a weird way, you're going to be a more powerful candidate if people believe that there are things that you are willing to lose for.
All right, I think we have one questioner. Yeah? All right, you are finished, so this has to be really, really good. No pressure.
Thank you very much for that. I'm Jacob Blitz. I'm a first year in the college. And I was just wondering, so GenForward focuses on better accounting for race and millennial politics, but you also touched on kind of differentiation by education versus family income. So I was wondering what demographic factors are going to be most important for understanding the different movements in millennial politics non-monolithically.
You did good. That was a great question.
Yeah, it's a very good question.
Yep.
I'll be brief, and then they can speak to.
No, you speak for us.
No, never, never. So the one thing that we wanted to do was to say that, in fact, the millennial generation is racially, ethnically diverse in a way that we haven't seen before. So we're first going to kind of think about how does race and ethnicity impact. On other surveys that are coming out, for example, we're also looking at questions of gender, questions of income. We think all of these things are important, and that really, if you want to understand millennials, we do a disservice when we talk about millennials as, again, a monolithic group. So I don't think we're saying any of these are more important than the other. We're saying, in fact, we're starting with race and ethnicity first and trying to kind of break out the groups so that we can figure out which demographics are going to be more important around the election versus around mobilization in terms of, you know, the movement for Black lives, and to really get kind of deeper in terms of our understanding of what millennials are doing.
Yep.
You don't look convinced.
Well, so with that, I will just echo what David said, which is that the real message here is that all of you who are students at the University of Chicago, maybe high school students from around here, are actually what this is about. I mean, we can sit up here and, you know, sort of talk and, you know, sort of speculate about what millennials do, but ultimately you all are the future of politics, and I think you have a great resource here at the University of Chicago to sort of figure that out and navigate it, but ultimately it's great for you to come to events like this. So thank you to you, and thank you to our great panelists for a good conversation.